welcome to the 905er podcast. I'm Roland Tanner.
I am Joel McLeod.
And we have the second of our interviews with prominent 905 region candidates today, and we're talking with Adam van Koeverden from the Liberal Party of Canada. Adam was a household name in Canada long before he ran for Parliament. He won an Olympic gold and multiple other Olympic medals in Sprint Kayak. And he grew up in Halton region and has said that joining Burloak Canoe Club was the turning point in a potentially troubled teenager, turning someone into someone who with an Olympic champion and serious career at a young age. So Adam is seeking re-election now as MP for Milton, a seat he took from the CPC's most prominent, one of the CPC's most prominent MPs and former ministers, Lisa Rait, in 2019. Since entering Parliament, he's played an active role in advocating for youth and seniors issues, promoting active living, improving environmental sustainability, and combating climate change. Welcome, Adam.
Thanks very much. It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me on your show.
So we're focusing on a few areas kind of that we think are important to the 905 region, and we'll get on to those in a second. Certainly, the environment, housing, things like this have been quite prominent in this campaign. I thought I'd start off with just a quick question about running for your second time, and kind of slightly cheeky question. Do you think this would be easier if there'd been electoral reform in 2015? That you would now be looking at a very different election?
I don't know. The problem with electoral reform is that of all the people that I've spoken to who are huge advocates for it, all and each have a different idea of what that looks like. And electoral reform is a big term that means many different things to many different people. So I suppose it depends. But I'm also a big believer in two things. One, that it's important to win if you want to get to Ottawa. I think it's important that you're elected. And, I might show my stripes a little bit with respect to my views on other levels of the government, if you know what I mean. I'm not going to get into that. But I do really think it's important to get elected and to win an election. In Canada, there are 338 elections. I don't need to tell you guys that. It's not just one. And I do appreciate that people send individual representatives up to Ottawa to do that work for them. And it's not the case that we vote for, just a party or a prime minister or a leader. But I also really believe in the notion of representation and the importance of having somebody local that's a voice for you and your priorities. I tell people all the time that I don't work for the Liberal Party. I don't work for the Prime Minister. I work for my voters. And, I chose the Liberal Party because I believe strongly that there are good ideas in the left and there's good ideas in the right. And that it's an incumbent responsibility of mine to work with everybody and to find solutions that work for everyone. So, the issue of electoral reform comes up sometimes at the doors. Don't want to open that can of worms necessarily. But I think it's important that the people who are up in Ottawa are elected to get up there. And I was proud to be elected in 2019. And I hope to do the same now, in 2021. It was the honor and privilege of my life. And, I'm also a big believer of playing the game as it is and not, blaming the results of the game on the rules that were there. And we have the rules. We know what the rules are. And certainly we can talk about whether or not they should change. But blaming the outcome of the game on the established rules, I suppose I'm an athlete, so maybe that's my personal opinion. But that's where I stand on that one.
It's a hobby of mine, but so I won't go too far down the road with that one because there's so many other issues we need to talk about as well. But let's turn to the environment, and one of the more difficult things one of the things that comes with being in government is that you have to defend a record as well as say what you're going to do, and you're the only one ever involved in an election that has to do that. And obviously, the environment is huge. It's the first election, I believe, where the three main parties are all kind of on board with some form of tax carbon pricing. And the main one of the main criticisms that's been leveled at Liberals as well. Yeah, you introduced carbon pricing on those provinces that didn't already have it. But what about that? You're kind of sucking and blowing at the same time because you're also buying a pipeline. How do you square that circle?
It's interesting because I think the NDP often says you bought a pipeline, but then they advocate for retaining all sorts of other public infrastructure. So I always find it interesting when the NDP, blame the government on the environmental side for buying a pipeline, but then also say at the same time that the government should buy and retain a lot of public infrastructure. It is public infrastructure. We still rely on fossil fuels and oil and gas in Canada. So I don't need to defend the Prime Minister's decision. It's something that happened years ago, and it's not how I'm going to fight climate change. Fighting that decision is not going to be how I fight climate change here in Milton. The way that I fight climate change here in Milton is by ensuring that bills like Bill C-12 get passed, and it did. That was the most ambitious environmental legislation ever passed in Canada. But also the Canadian Environmental Protection Act is another very, very ambitious plan to protect way, way more natural land in Canada than any previous government. In 2015, when the Liberals were elected, less than 1% of Canada's land mass was protected. And at that point, they made an ambition to protect 25% of it by 2025. And it's 2021 and 14% of Canada's land mass is now protected. And the next goal is to protect 30% of it by 2030. And, it's a convenient scheme, the way the numbers work out, but it's an achievable goal. And it's one that will do a tremendous amount to ensure that we're doing everything that we can in Canada and being really good stewards for our natural environment in Canada. Some of the local work that I'm really proud of is ensuring that Conservation Halton can continue to do their very important work on climate change mitigation and resiliency strategies that they do. But they also do a lot of species at risk work locally that's important. But we also partnered up for our tree planting program, and I relied on Conservation Halton to apply for and then plant over 50,000 trees here in the Halton region over the past couple of months. A lot of people suggested that maybe 50,000 trees over 5 years would be ambitious, but Conservation Halton got them all in the ground. So that's part of our 2 billion tree ambition and initiative. And I'm proud that we've got trees going in the ground right here in Milton to help get us to that big 2 billion number in the next decade.
On that note, we've also spoken with a representative from Environmental Defense just to get a background on the importance of climate change in this election. And one of the other factors that was mentioned in our discussion with him was the importance of getting the housing strategy right, because of the fact that in the 905, for decades, we just kept building out. We just kept building, increasing the sprawl and just kept spreading out. Other interesting factor at the start of this election was how housing strategy became such an important part of the national dialogue. And I understand that I'm going to give the floor over to you, Adam, and maybe just kind of give us what where the Liberal priorities in terms of the housing strategy is to address that.
Absolutely. Well, I think the reason why that the housing strategy is linked to our environmental policies are because buildings and homes are large emitters of of carbon emissions, and they use a lot of fossil fuels, and that's certainly the case here in Milton because we still have quite a lot of kind of rural areas that don't have access to natural gas, so they have to use home heating oil to heat their homes, and the Canadian climate is such that in the summer we use air conditioning, and then it's only a couple of weeks before we turn on our heating, just because we're kind of a country of extreme temperatures now. So the way that homes are built and building them efficiently really makes a big impact on our energy usage. But I did want to address something, because something that you said reminded me of an anecdote that I heard and I have a personal experience with back in 2005. Back in 2005, I was fresh off of a sort of an Olympic success, and I was training really hard for our World Championships, which I think they were in Croatia in 2005. And throughout that summer, there were, I think, 41 smog days, which was a record. That meant that the air was unsafe to breathe 41 days out of 365, which is, I think we can all agree, way too many. That's 10% of the year being unsafe to be outside. So I actually had to leave Canada that summer and train somewhere else, so that I could, rely on the basic necessity of oxygen and endurance sport to get my job done. Now, the Liberal provincial party, the provincial Liberals at the time, ran on a promise to close all the coal-fired power plants in the next election, and they did that. And the air quality index in southwestern Ontario has changed so dramatically for the better that since then, since 2005, in the last 16 years, there's been fewer than 41 cumulative smog days. I think there's only actually been like 10 or 12 smog days in this province since then, which is a remarkable achievement. And it really is an indicator that elections matter and promises matter. And one of the promises that I'm really proud of in our platform with respect to a greener and a cleaner future is the home energy audit program, where people can apply to the federal government to get a grant to improve the quality of their windows, their doors, to make sure that they're not drafty, to make sure their home's efficient, and to make sure that they're not wasting energy. Because buildings are actually, we don't necessarily all think of buildings as large emitters. We think of our vehicles as large emitters, but both our vehicles and our homes present opportunities for cutting emissions and for a greener and a cleaner future. So not only are we looking to build more EV charging stations, subsidize the purchase of electric vehicles, and ensure that they're built here in Canada. And I'm proud that since we're talking on the 905er, many of those Fords will be built in Oakville and provide great green jobs for many of my local residents. But we're addressing the problem at the source and ensuring that Canadians can make the choices that they want to make with respect to the home that they live in and the car that they drive and the travel that they do in a green and clean way.
With really the federal government, one of the things that seems to have happened, and to an extent this has been happening during COVID, and also with most obviously perhaps with the carbon tax, basically only applying to those provinces that don't have one in place themselves. Are we seeing the federal government have to, is it either overstepping the mark, or is it a matter of the federal government stepping in to do things that the provinces aren't doing, which actually just encourages the provinces to say, hey, we don't want to pay for this, we'll just wait until the feds cough up? Is this a problem that kind of needs to be addressed, that because we have this kind of foggy relationship between the federal and provincial governments in many ways, that we're kind of almost fighting over who gets to pay for things or who gets not to pay for things?
Well, I suppose I'd come back to my earlier point that you need to play the game with the rules intact. You can't, just constantly say that the problem with the game is the way that the rules are structured. We are a confederation of provinces and territories in Canada, and there are some jurisdictional challenges that come along with that. But there's also some, there's some challenges, but there's certainly some benefits to that program as well. And look, carbon pricing is an essential aspect of an effective plan to deal with climate change and to address all of the problems that come along with it. But it's not sufficient, and it's also not the only aspect of our greener and cleaner Canada plan going forward. Not only are we cutting pollution and addressing carbon emissions, we're also creating green jobs, and which will over time reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and carbon intensive technologies and practices, but it'll also improve the economy, because time and time again, the Prime Minister has said that if you don't have a plan to address climate change, then you don't have a plan for the economy, and vice versa. I've already addressed the plan to protect nature, and a lot of people, when they think about climate change, they think about the rainforest and polar bears and glaciers caving off into the ocean. And that kind of framing of it puts climate change very far away from us here in Milton, Ontario. And it's important to recognize that climate change not only happens here with our carbon emissions, but it also impacts us here. Things like, what we experienced this past week with a torrential downpour. 3 of my friends, mentioned to me that their roofs were leaking because of the amount of rain that fell on Milton over the course of 24 hours. I think somebody told me that was an average monthly rainfall all in 24 hours, which is an example of extreme weather. So we have an adaptation plan to protect against the impacts of climate change and mitigate some of the impacts, because that's important. We can't ignore the fact that our climate is going to change over the coming years and decades. So we need to be prepared for that. But we also need to mitigate and demonstrate to countries around the world that you can grow your economy and address climate change at the same time. Because, as conservatives love to point out, Canada is only responsible for 1.5% of global emissions. And I think that's small. 1.5% is actually a lot when you consider that Canada is less than 0.5% of the global population. So that means that on average, each Canadian has 3 times the average carbon footprint of a human being in the world. And it's because of the decisions that we make. It's some of them that we can't avoid, like, okay, we've got a cold country in the winter and we need to heat our homes, and we've got a hot country in the summer and we need to run air conditioning. A lot of our foods come from far away because it's, you can't grow an avocado in Canada. But it also comes down to choices that we can make that are different than the ones that we do make. The best selling car in Canada is the Ford F-150, which is, just naturally not exactly great on gas. I know that it's very functional, and a lot of my friends drive medium-sized trucks and love them because they can put their bikes in the back and their kids in the back and everything. It's very, very good in the winter too. It's safe. But we need to identify ways that we can continue to live our Canadian lives without being so carbon intensive. And, that de-intensification, that decarbonization is a process that requires a plan for the economy, for housing, and it requires a plan for the environment. And last but not least, an opportunity to decarbonize even more is to eliminate single-use plastics. As a kayaker, somebody that spent a tremendous amount of time in the water, I can tell you that a lot of that plastic ends up into our waterways and pollutes. But it's also totally unnecessary. It's completely unnecessary to use a straw that you use once and then throw it in the garbage and is around forever because it's made out of, plastic, which is hydrocarbons. It's an enormous waste of, what should be considered a very valuable commodity. Plastics shouldn't be disposable. They should be valued. And, if you have something that's plastic, it should be reusable or recyclable, not something that you throw into the trash. Canada's blessed with a great pulp and paper industry, and virtually everything that we use that is single-use plastics can be made out of paper or some renewable product that can compost very, very quickly. And when those products end up in our lakes and rivers, they don't pollute, they decompose, and they turn into compost. So these are the types of solutions that are in our platform that I'm very, very proud of. And they're also unique. They're unique offerings because, experts look at the environmental platforms of all 4 parties, and they recognize that the Liberal plan is worth an 8 out of 10. So, room for improvement. And certainly when I get back up to Ottawa and we're in government, I would try to at least score an A+. I'm an ambitious person, so hopefully we can change that to address some of the concerns that top environmentalists and paleoclimatologists have. But they also say that the Conservatives are at a failing grade of 5 out of 10 and that the NDP are a shocking 2 out of 10 because they don't have a plan to strike a balance and make sure that we still have an economy as we address climate change. Because, if we plunge 20 million Canadians into poverty as a result of fighting climate change, then that's not exactly an effective plan either. There
was something you mentioned at the start of that. You were talking about, you mentioned a couple of times about wanting to, you have to play the game with the rules that are how the rules are. And this is a question that's popped up in my circle a number of times, and I'd be lambasted by my friends if I didn't ask it. And basically, it's why are we playing the game at all right now? The question that keeps coming up is why are we in an election right now? The sense on the ground in the 905 from people that Roland and I have talked to is that things seemed, from our perspective, things were getting done. COVID aid was getting out the door to small businesses and to people who needed it. The vaccine rollout was, by all accounts, a success right now, and it seemed that we were getting things done. We're now in an election, and this is something that I personally I've been a bit upset about with not just the Liberal Party, but this is the Conservative and the NDP are equally guilty of this. I have not seen a big post-COVID-19 recovery vision of what Canada is going to look like or how we're going to rebuild an economy with the threat of COVID still hanging over our heads for the foreseeable future. That's a big topic, but I'm wondering, can you explain why to our listeners, why are we in an election, and why is it that COVID-19 has kind of become a C story of this election?
First of all, it shouldn't be a C story. Ending the fight against COVID-19 is the top line of our platform, and it is the most important part of our platform. And it's also one that's extremely unique because we are the party that were in government when COVID-19 hit, and we are the party who were in government when we, procured all of the vaccines, everything necessary to deal with COVID-19, despite the constant obstruction and naysaying of the Conservative Party in particular. Look, I would say that things were getting done in Parliament despite a lot of obstruction and despite a very toxic environment, not because of it. And what this country needs now is 4 years of certainty, not 2 years of, an election hanging over everybody's head. And that's what we had leading into this fall term is, the Conservatives were campaigning away. O'Toole had already, issued his platform, and, they were, every time, you guys know what an SO31 is, when MPs have a minute to talk about issues that are important to their community. Every other one was a platform promise from a Conservative, and just a line out of their book, with the Men's Health book with Mr. O'Toole's new physique on the cover. And I'm sorry, but if that's not campaigning, then I don't know what is. My opponent has been knocking on doors in Milton for the last 6 months. So if they're not signaling that they want an election through these actions and many others, including 12 non-confidence votes over the last 4 months, then what is? They were relishing in the opportunity to say, oh, Mr. Trudeau, you called an election that nobody wants. This is an election that we need because Canada desperately needs 4 years of certainty with a majority government full of progressive people that believe in vaccination, that believe in climate change, that believe in truth and reconciliation, and believe in investing in the middle class for a better future through initiatives like a national child care policy, a plan for seniors that doesn't leave anybody behind, the first increases in OAS and GIS since 1973, and an environmental plan that experts agree on our plan is by far head and shoulders above the rest. So in a minority government, an election can happen at any time. And for those who are saying, things were really getting done in Parliament, man, you guys were really getting stuff done for Canadians. Some of those emergency bills that we were passing, that didn't receive that much debate because they just needed to get out immediately. And there's no party in Canada that would stand up against an emergency measure that was there just to support Canadians. So that kind of stuff happened, but we still had the Conservatives, raising bills to talk about reopening the abortion debate. And they all voted against Bill C6, which is a bill to protect LGBTQ2S plus kids from the harmful practices of conversion practices. I won't call it therapy because it's not, it's torture. And more than half of Conservatives voted to not ban that practice. More than half of Conservatives voted to reopen the abortion debate with a horrendous private members bill. Look, these types of conversations are done. Yeah, climate change exists. Yeah, vaccines are effective. Yeah, LGBTQ2S plus kids deserve the same mental health supports and dignity as the rest of Canadians. The number of times I heard a Conservative stand up in the House of Commons and address the very, very important issue of mental health for Canadians, and then weeks later saw them vote against a bill to ban conversion therapy. What dawned on me is those Conservatives don't believe in mental health services for every Canadian. Not, because what are they saying when they're voting to allow conversion therapy to continue in Canada, and then also say that we need better mental health services? Conversion therapy results in something like a 7 to 9 times increase in attempted suicide amongst LGBTQ2S plus youth. And they're voting for it. So this was the type of toxic environment. Look, I spent 55 hours in the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Committee debating whether or not the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People Act should be passed. And obviously, because we heard from Indigenous leaders and, the presidents of ITK, Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, and the First Nations Assembly and the Métis Nation, that this was absolutely a number one priority. And the Conservative obstructed and obstructed it and obstructed it. And eventually they all voted against it en masse. They voted against basic human rights for Indigenous people.
So I could just
all of that time, if I could finish, all of that time could have been spent dealing with the pandemic, and all of that time could have been spent addressing climate change and taking real action on truth and reconciliation. So I disagree that it was a really productive period of time in the House of Commons. It was tumultuous and it was toxic. And what Canada needs now is 4 years of certainty going forward.
So, I many of those points we're certainly familiar with. But that raises the point of, in the way our parliaments work, there are two things you can do. You can call an election, or you can go to one of the opposition parties and say, hey, what can we do to work something out here? And it doesn't have to be a coalition. It doesn't have to be, there are all forms. I was tweeting the other day about election that happened in Scotland recently, and that government fell short of majority by one seat. One seat. Now, here, no one would ever dream of doing any kind of deal over one seat. There, they went out and they spoke to the Green Party and they said, hey, what can we do? It doesn't have to be a coalition. We just want some kind of understanding so that, you get something which is, a minister, something like that. We get something which is a guarantee that we can get through 4 years with, our platform and deliver that kind of stability that you're talking about. Now, why couldn't you do that with say, Jagmeet Singh, who you may disagree about many things, but we know there's a whole bunch of things you do agree about. Maybe you could have gone to him and said, look, we'll give you electoral reform, and in return, we get X, Y, Z. So that's the other option. Why is it that there's never any exploration of that other route towards a stable government?
Can I ask? I'm not familiar with the electoral system in Scotland. How many distinct parties are there?
There's about the same as there are in Canada right now.
But are you including the PPC and the Greens in that? Because in other countries, like the Green Party actually elects MPs, and we just had the most ever with 3 and then 2. So
yeah, sure.
Is it a party that elects? I imagine there's probably a couple of Greens in Parliament in Scotland.
Yeah.
And really, there's 4 parties in Canada, right? And I mean, the Greens and the Bloc are special in various ways, in the sense that the Greens elect very few people, and the Bloc are only representing one province. But I'll give you the honest answer. I mean, it's not my job to determine when we have elections. It's my job to win them. And I'm happy to spend the last 6 weeks of my summer reconnecting with my neighbors when it became safe to, and ask them for their confidence so that I can go back to Ottawa for 4 years and keep working for them. And, a lot of people are like, oh, an election, that's terrible. Like, I'm sorry, do you have to knock on 100,000 doors? All you really have to go and do is vote. Like, voting's not very hard. You might have to listen to a debate or two. But we're talking about the progress of our country here. And, the opposition parties want an election. They can't say that they don't want an election. They wanted one. They just wanted one at a time where, they could win more seats. And in August, it was a time when polls, indicated that it wasn't a time when the NDP or the Conservatives would win more seats. And we'll see in 11 or 12 days if that's still true. But I'm hoping that we can go back to Ottawa with 4 years of certainty so that we can get things done without having to debate, old ideas that don't require, don't necessitate our 55 hours of debate again, right? Like, I think it's important that we pass these important bills expediently, because as you guys are well aware, government is agonizingly slow. And as an athlete that tried to go as fast as possible for 20 years, I want to see the most important legislation get done as quickly as possible for Canadians.
Well, we all definitely want to see progress being done as soon as possible at all levels. The question, but on my mind though, is you're talking about you want a majority, and everybody wants a majority. But right now, the polls are indicating no party has the support of enough Canadians to form a majority. It looks like we're going back to another minority government. How prepared are you to work with that minority government, however it turns out to be structured, to carry on with the business of the people?
100%. I'm 100% prepared to get back up to Ottawa and work in any context for the benefit of my neighbors here in Milton and for Canadians from coast to coast to coast. That's my job. And I can't determine the outcome from 10 days out. I don't think anybody can. Polls are kind of irrelevant to me. I'll be honest. I mean, I pay attention to them, obviously, but it's sort of like looking at the weather in another country. It doesn't really impact you on that day whatsoever. The answer, if you're ahead in the polls, is go knock doors. And the answer, if you're behind in polls, is go knock doors. So I'm just going to keep knocking doors and keep asking for the confidence of my neighbors to go back up to Ottawa and keep working for them. Like I said, it's not my job to determine when elections happen. It's my job to win them. And that's what I'm focused on now. And I'm enjoying it. Elections are tough, particularly for candidates and volunteers. But I am grateful for the opportunity to re-earn the confidence of my electorate.
One thing I know about elections is well, compared with kayaking on the a 6 mile creek, isn't it? The
16 mile.
16 mile. I knew there was a 6 in there somewhere. Compared with that, not quite the same kind of exercise, but it's a great way to lose weight. I know you don't need to, but
I had my COVID-19 in terms of, like, I called it the COVID-19 pounds between the campaign. between the campaign in 2019 and the height of pandemic, when we were, mostly ordering craft beer through Canada Post to sit at home and watch Netflix and do our work on Zoom, I gained 19 pounds. And wow. That might not, it's not a lot maybe, but it was over a very short period of time. And it was depressing for me, to be honest. Like, it was hard to not have the opportunity to go and exercise with my friends and to get out on the water and, or the motivation, because it was just a tough time, socially and mentally for so many people, psychologically, certainly. But I have been feeling a little bit more, motivated, getting out and talking to people. That's what the sport of politics is all about. It's about connecting with people. So I don't think anything bad can come from getting out and knocking on doors and talking to my neighbors. And I've been enjoying the last 3 weeks or 4 weeks or so. It's been fun.
I think we've got time for just like one last small question, and we appreciate so much the time you've given to us today. But I think it would be wrong of us not to address the First Nations side of the story, which has been so important this year. There's a lot of good talk from all the parties, and I've been through all the platforms, kind of comparing and contrasting, and it's good talk. But how? I mean, we've had a couple of episodes speaking to two First Nations journalists, Carl Dockstader and Sean Vanderklees, and the theme that comes through from them is this theme of nation to nation communication that. For instance, in Caledonia, I know that's primarily a provincial issue, but taking the Caledonia dispute, they wanted someone senior to come and sit down and talk nation to nation. We used the word First Nations. The First Nations people never signed anything that said we're Canadians now and we are the same as everybody else. That's in fact what the entire residential school issue is about. How do we transform that relationship in a way that puts it on a more mature level, where it's not a matter of, okay, what are we going to do to stop these First Nations people kind of complaining? How are we going to take it to that genuinely nation to nation level of conversation? And does that mean, literally someone like the actual Prime Minister being involved intimately with these issues and treating it like you would any other nation to nation conversation?
Yeah, I agree that it is a huge priority, and it's one of the reasons why I'm proud of the fact that one of our platform sections is all about our relationship with Indigenous people in this country. And I did spend the last 2 years on the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Committee with incredible MPs from all parties, and got to work on a historic piece of legislation in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act, and I'm grateful that we passed it, despite some parties voting against it. But our platform on Indigenous truth and reconciliation has 4 parts. The most glaring and the one that I get the question about most is clean water for Indigenous communities. And, it's hard to talk about progress when there's still so much work to be done, but it is also important to recognize progress when it's been done so that you know how to keep moving forward. And, when the Liberal government was elected in 2015, clean water for Indigenous communities wasn't even on the radar of Stephen Harper and the Conservative Party. Neither was missing and murdered Indigenous women. It was not even an afterthought. It didn't even come close to being on their agenda. Despite that, in the last 6 years, the Liberal Party, the government of Canada, has lifted 109 of the boil water advisories across country. And like I said, there's 105 in 2015. So if the numbers don't work out, it's because that infrastructure has been neglected for decades and decades by successive Liberal and Conservative governments. So clean water for Indigenous communities remains a top priority, and it is 1/4 of our platform on Indigenous truth and reconciliation. Progress has been made, and I refute any assertion that it could have gone faster or we should have done more sooner, because $4 billion has been invested in some 500 water projects across the country, and I think it's 68% of them have been lifted, and a further 20% are the clean water is coming out of the tap. They just haven't been able to lift the boil water advisory for testing reasons. So that's significant progress, and it'll continue to go forward. And it's really, really important that we continue to make that a reality for every single Indigenous community across Canada. But on that same point, we've also got to ensure that we continue to address the horrible legacy of the residential school system and colonialism in this country. There's intergenerational trauma, which is being experienced by people of Indigenous communities from coast to coast to coast. And, we can't ignore the fact that I hesitate to say dark chapter, because it's an ongoing cultural genocide that is perpetrated by the federal government and the agencies within it. And that is, again, another part of our platform that I'm firmly committed to. And, part of that is also protecting the well-being of Indigenous children. I think we can see, when you look into better outcomes for Indigenous children, more self-determination is the best path forward, making sure that communities have the capacity to run their own education systems, to run their own policing systems, to provide culturally appropriate healthcare, and to ensure that the resources are available for communities to be autonomous and self-governing. That's critical. Now, your question was about nation-to-nation conversations, and as a member of that committee, the Indigenous Northern Affairs Committee, we had former First Nation Assembly of First Nations Chief Perry Bellegarde, and we had the presidents of ITK, which is Natan Obed, and the president of the Métis Nation as well, present numerous times to the committee. And I know that those leaders also have a forum with the Prime Minister, as well as a forum with the Minister of Indigenous Services and the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations. So I believe that those conversations are happening, and increased dialogue, more active listening, and more action coming out of these conversations is really, really important, because what I recognized more than anything else after my time on the Indigenous Northern Affairs Committee is that Canada's Indigenous population is as diverse as the whole rest of Canada, and the issues, problems, preoccupations, perspectives, and insights of all of the nations and all the people within it are important to take into consideration when walking forward on the path of truth and reconciliation and planning the future of this country. And it's a priority. It's certainly a priority for me here on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I know that I've got work here to do in Halton, but it's also a priority for me as we improve outcomes for Indigenous people from coast to coast to coast as well.
Well, I think we're going to have to leave it on that note for this week's episode. But we want to thank you, Adam, for taking the time out of your busy campaign. We're recording this on the night of the English debate, so I'm sure you're going to want to hop off and probably go to a campaign function or something to watch on the TV or whatever have you. But thank you very much for taking the time to answer our questions, and good luck on the campaign trail.
Oh, thanks, Joel, and thanks, Roland. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat.
Great. All the very best.
Thanks.
That's it for this episode of the 905er. Thank you for listening. As always, you can send us your feedback, thoughts, and concerns, or ideas for future episodes to our email, info@905er.ca. We'd love to hear from you. You can help us keep the 905er going by financially supporting us through Patreon as well as PayPal. Visit us at 905er.ca and click on the support tab. As well, links are in the show notes for your convenience. Lastly, you can find us on social media. Search for _905er on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So long for now. See you next time.
looking to make the most out of this life and optimize your personal wellness? Then check out the Natural Man Podcast. Join me, host Mike C., as we explore all areas of human wellness, physical, mental, and emotional. Learn strategies to optimize your own well-being and be in the driver's seat of your own health. Remember, your doctor works for you. Learn biohacks, neurohacks, ways to improve sleep, and ways to optimize your body and your mind. Check us out on Apple, Spotify, the Fountain app, and at naturalmanpodcast.com.